Thank you. So hello, and thank you everybody for being here. This is a topic that Chris and I are both very invested and interested in. To give a short introduction, I spent the first 20 years of my career in the world of developmental disabilities, so talking and with and getting to know and helping people whose brains are different because of developmental disabilities. And then I switched into the world of mental health, and I spent 20 years as a child and adolescent therapist, again working with kids that were on the mental health spectrum, but also additional needs. And I'm also now, I do presenting and speaking, and I write continuing ed credits and present in various times and places. So this was an easy yes for me. Christoph is my graduate student, and we have been talking about this topic since he started with us. Actually, to be fair, we've been talking about this topic since forever, since we've known each other, because we are both neurospicy. So neurodivergence is a topic of academic and professional interest, and also what the inside of our brains look like. So we're going to focus on how do we support inclusion, combining both neuro-inclusion and trauma responsive practices. We are 100% open to input, questions, feedback, so feel free to drop stuff in the chat, and we will respond as soon as we can. All right, make sure our PowerPoint's going.
And if we don't get to a question, we can always try to send out a follow-up link or something for info.
Yes. This is our contact information. I am active on LinkedIn, so if you are a LinkedIn denizen, feel free to send me a request to connect. I've been encouraging Chris to do the same. So, and the other piece of it is if you have a question or would like a little more information about anything we talk about, send us an email. All right. So the basics. Everybody has a brain. Genetics shape brains. So part of who you are and who your students or clients are is their genetic heritage. And experiences shape brains. Trauma in particular, making a huge difference in how we perceive and process and respond to the world. But all the other ways that our brains are impacted by our life experiences. And neurodiversity is normal. Neurodiversity is not a diagnosis. So someone being neurodivergent means they are out of the typical, but it is obviously not a diagnostic term. When we talk about neurodiversity, it's everything. Being left-handed is a way of being neurodivergent because most people are not. And then there's all those little personality quirks. Like I know a guy who can tell color so distinctly that he can like look at the cupboards in your kitchen and go, oh, it's that shade of white. And then without taking a sample with him, go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy the correct color white because he can see color like that. I can look at my couch, go to the store to buy a pillow, and come home and realize it doesn't begin to match. Like if I want something to match my couch, I'm going to be hauling a couch cushion with me, because I don't have that sense of color. And there's again, there's those people who are very attuned to sound, or they're very attuned to smell. There are professional noses, people who are hired to smell perfumes, or worse yet, body odor, because their sense of smell is not typical. And so there's lots of ways for people to be neurodiverse. And it's one of my lifelong fascinations is how people are different
And how we can support them.
and how we can support them. And so usually this neurodiversity doesn't really come to anyone's attention until it creates a glitch in the system. So we're going to talk about neurodiversity and neuro-inclusion as they relate specifically to the workplace and to adult learning. We're going to look at the bidirectional causation between neurodiversity and trauma, and then explain how trauma responsive practices and neuro-inclusion practices support and amplify each other and benefit, and particularly for all y'all, um, benefit educational culture and productivity. And this is where, as we get into specifics, you're more than welcome to chime in with examples or questions. We all know this. So this is neurodiversity is just those people who are divergent, those people whose the way they perceive or process the world is not typical. Because the world is designed for the typical people. Any of you here left-handed? You can drop in chat if you're a lefty. You know the whole world is designed for right-handed people, right? That one simple neurodivergence makes for awkwardness, and or you have to spend extra money or buy a special notebook so that like a spiral notebook so that thing isn't in your way.
Get the special scissors or the other door handle on the
Right.
fridge.
Right. So the world is designed for neurotypical. And so being neurodivergent impacts people in their whole lives. Again, we're going to focus on work and learning. So how are some ways? So I'll let Chris take some of this if he doesn't knock over his water glass.
I may knock over my water glass. Case and point. Some people might be a little more introspective or perceptive than others. I do crash into things like corners a lot. That is another way you can be neurodiverse. You can
Yeah.
miss
Yeah.
the memo that there is a wall there, in fact. And so we have things like people being sensory seeking, or being really, really sensitive to maybe the lights, or like I am one of the people that can hear buzzing in lights. Not everyone can, and then people can be like, "That's kind of weird that you think the lights are buzzing," because they are.
Well, how does it work when someone tells you to just ignore it?
Oh, it works so well. It's like you ignore a rock in your shoe. It's all you can think about, and it's there, and it just constantly grates at you. Um, and so again, we have maybe needing some more clarity, maybe being more literal, having not only in school settings, but maybe in work settings, having opportunities for taking a break, moving. This could also look like maybe you doodle during the meeting, or you crochet, or I sometimes mindfully color, because if my hands are doing something, it helps my brain be able to focus on what's being said. And wherein this kind of, as Laura was saying, it kind of, glitches a little bit, is where if other people perceive that as being disrespectful or
Mhm.
breaking that social norm, they might perceive that that's not being a respectful or, listening or attentive.
I'm the person who crochets all the time, and I did have a professor say, "I need you to put that down so you can pay attention." And I'm like, "I'm doing this so I can pay attention." Like making multiple granny squares is easy, and it keeps my brain and my body calm enough to absorb the input. But he was like, "No, no, no, put it away." And I'm like, "Yeah." So I moved to snacking, which was not a healthier choice. I'm like, I can't sit here and do nothing. Like that is not an option for my body. And my brain is to sit still. I was on a plane recently and there was a woman sitting next to me and she did nothing. And I started to time her. And I'm like, how do you do that? How do you sit for 40 minutes and do literally nothing? I,
Not me.
yeah.
No, I would have been up, down, left, right,
Yeah.
colored, play it on my phone, done the hokey pokey, talk to 8 other people
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
that time period. Um, and so we think about these things that they're not bad, they're normal, they're just a different way of
Mhm.
communicating. And so we think about maybe communicating in writing. Maybe some people need to either have a screen reader to see and read and hear it, or maybe they communicate better verbally. So thinking about how people are communicating what they're actually saying, not what you're perceiving that they are saying, I think is so important, not only in the academic arena, but also the professional one for coworkers, for clients, for if you're a supervisor, for your staff, thinking about that they could just be operating on a slightly different wavelength, then
Mhm.
maybe we can make that work and not
Mhm.
perceive it as a negative.
Right. And the person's not being disrespectful or they're not unmotivated, they're not lazy. It's not that they don't care. It's that they again, they're neurodivergent. So the high levels of clarity, I have an example from my backyard neighbor is a contractor and he was working on a house and his supervisor said, this client's really picky. These windows need to be perfect. So he's like, got it, perfect windows. And at the end of the day, his supervisor came back and was like, wow, we're way off schedule. We should have had 8 windows done. You've only done 4. And he's like, you said perfect. And his boss was like, I meant perfect, but stay on schedule. And he was like, then you should have said that because I did what you told me to do, not what you were thinking inside your head. And that's another example of someone who's a very literal thinker is they hear exactly what you say. And so after that, he started when his supervisor would come around and go, okay, here's the plan for the day. And his name is also Chris. Um, Chris would say, all right, let me tell you what I heard. And his boss is like, why do we have to play this game every day? And he's like, this is not a game. This is to make sure that I'm doing the things that you're thinking in your head that you forgot to say out loud. So that when you come this evening, what's done is what you want done. And his boss was like, you're so difficult. He's like, I'm literally the opposite of being difficult. I am literally trying to ensure that I do the work that you intend to have me do. And so there's an example of a literal thinker who recognized that it was happening. And so he created a modification for himself that was working, but his boss found him to be like, oh, you're so picky. And part of the deal is he is picky and his work is magnificent, but it's because he's such a detail-oriented person. I want to talk about this flexibility and energy management. There's some new information I've been reading lately that another way that people are neurodivergent is in their how's it called their chronicity. And so most people are morning person, evening person, night owl. Drop in chat. What do you consider yourself? Are you a lark? Are you that person that wakes up early and gets going early and you do your best thinking first thing in the morning? Are you a night owl? Are you like morning sucks and I'd rather and you're like if you really want to be creative, you sit down late in the evening when the rest of the world is asleep and get your stuff done. That's a classic night owl. Um, One way that people are neurodivergent is some people, their schedule's just kind of all over the place. They are not a morning person or a night owl. They have a much spikier profile. They are not as predictable. Now, I tend towards morning, and at 3 o'clock, I might as well just like I've learned not to do any writing at 3 in the afternoon because I don't have a brain. That's when I like do laundry or run errands or go for coffee because nothing creative is happening at 3. Erica, I have bad news for you. You're a night owl, but you're trying to be a morning person. That's hard to shift. Those are um, parts of our personality that are a little bit more hardwired than some. You do your best peopling in the morning and afternoon with greatest ideas are after 8. Yes. Yeah. And so that's an example of neurodiversity. Is this our our time schedules? And some people are just way more spiky in that. Um, yeah, Erica, exactly. And that's exactly what we're talking about is the whole world, we're gonna have a team meeting at 9 in the morning And the night owls are like, I don't even want to see 9 in the morning.
Yep.
But the world is set up that way. Sleep is my BFF. So this energy management tends to be spikier in some people. And so if you have to do a lot of peopling, for some people that energizes them and some people it crashes them out. And it's maybe less predictable or less typical than other people. So that's another kind of neurodivergence. The deeper I get into this, the more interesting it gets.
And you also may have completely intended to be able to be conscious for that morning meeting, and then your body was like, nope, not going to do it. And then you suddenly get a wave of energy, in the evening, and people are like, why are you messaging me at 9 o'clock at night?
Yes.
Laura wonders why I message her at 9 o'clock at night.
And so that's the thing, working together is that I am more of a morning person and Chris is more of a night owl. And so we meet at 6 in the evening when I'm still awake and his brain is there. Because we have to figure out like when do our patterns of creativity overlap? Yeah,
And it's bonus hard when it changes.
yeah. You're more variable than I am. My pattern is more set. So neuro-inclusion is creating environments, practices, and processes that are inclusive of all people's cognitive processing requirements. And the act of listening to and valuing the views and support requirements of people whose thinking and behavior significantly diverge from prominent expressions. A lot of this is having respectful curiosity. Um, I'm probably super accommodating because I'm fascinated by it. And I'm neurospicy myself. Um, but I have worked with people who are like, people just need to buckle down. They need to act professional. They need to get their act together. And it's like telling, well, the right-handed, left-handed thing. Anyone have an older relative who was forced to use their right hand when they were actually left-handed? Megan, who was that in your family? And Christina.
Yeah, my dad, so he can use both hands now because he's naturally more left-handed, but he was forced to be right-handed. Yeah.
Yep.
He is more ambidextrous now.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so that was a thing back in the day. My dad was that same, and his handwriting was atrocious.
And it didn't actually change people being left-handed. It just burnt them out and stressed them out and made their handwriting look kind of dismal.
Right.
That actually
So,
happened to me as a kid. Not forced. It was just everybody else was right-handed, and so I have horrible handwriting
mhm.
as a result. And I'm very right-handed, although I should have been left-handed. So that's my
Yes,
problem, if anybody wondered.
so you weren't forced, but there was this, everyone kept teaching you how to write with your right hand.
Yeah, or they kept handing me things. Uh,
Mhm.
and so, yeah, I mean, I think it did have a kind of there's, some subtleties with me in terms of that, but it happened. It's okay.
Oh, Christy, that's funny. You're left-handed, but you can only cut right-handed because they didn't have the right scissors.
Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah.
I'm completely right-handed now, but I started off
Interesting.
left-handed. So,
So
yeah.
feel free to drop it in the chat. What is your interest in neuro-inclusion? Why are you here today, other than for that one CEU? I get it. I'm a social worker too.
CEU, yeah, especially free CEUs.
But what's your interest in neuro-inclusion? So drop in chat or
People are
unmute.
so inclined, can they unmute?
Yes, unmute. You can raise your hand and we can call on you. We can do all the things. Your team adaptability here.
We're being neuro-inclusive,
Mm-hmm.
giving options.
You have a nephew who's neurodivergent as well as several friends. It is so very interesting.
It is.
Your son has autism. Difficult to get people to get him. Yes. Yep. Your cousin's wife has been talking about it. Working with students. New ideas are a plus. Lindsay, yeah, people are identifying the way they want inclusion, and so you need to be more aware of doing it. Yes. And that's the hard thing about neurodivergence is there's lots of ways um, to be neurodivergent. And so, and more people are learning about their own neurodivergence. Like I only in the last year talking to some people have I realized that I have a sound aversion. I just thought I hated vacuuming and mowing. And as I've talked to other people talk about their aversion to certain noises, I'm like, that is literally, it's not that I don't like the task, it's I don't like the noise.
You are sound sensitive.
I am sound sensitive and wasn't really, I never considered it a form of neurodivergence, but I realize now it is. We have an accommodation specialist here. I appreciate all your input and feel free to engage in chat with one another. You can comment back to people or give them a heart or yeah.
I'm seeing a lot of, either people themselves being late diagnosed with like ADHD, autism, ADHD, um, having family members that are, daughter has dyslexia.
Yeah, like, Ashley, I think a lot of us grew up trying to fit a narrow mold and that learning that there's not necessarily anything wrong with you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's where we've come is that we've got this is a social movement. Neuro-inclusion is a social movement. And the idea that there are lots of different kinds of brains, and that's good. Like we need those people who can recognize paint colors. We need the people who can operate in the middle of the night, and we need the people that can operate first thing in the morning. And then when people have things like dyslexia and all the other learning disabilities, they often develop workarounds or ways of dealing with things that allow for a level of creativity that you don't see in someone who's neurotypical because the world is built for someone who's neurotypical. So there are strengths to all of this. And so when we look at the umbrella of what falls under neurodivergent, we are looking at autism, ADHD, all the learning disabilities. Some would argue some of the mental health issues, like this is an inclusive umbrella, not an exclusive.
And I think it also really depends on where you are in the world, because different countries and different cultures are like, that's diagnosable, and then other people be like, nah, that's like them on a Tuesday, like that's fine. Um, and so I think just again honoring people's different strengths and acknowledging that that's
Hmm.
how they roll.
Yep.
And that we should celebrate and uplift that.
And I'm happy to see you all interacting with each other on here. Um, Currently writing a blog series about ecosystems and our need to be connected one to another. So feel free to connect with each other here. It's the advantage, disadvantage of Zoom is that you can't see each other, but you can still connect and interact with each other. So I want to talk about this research article, and there is at the very end of our PowerPoint slide, we do have our bibliography, so you can screenshot that when we get to it, or go back. This is being recorded, yes, so you can go back and look at the recording if you missed that, or you can email us. But this article makes so much sense to me. It's the complex interplay between adverse childhood experiences and neurodevelopmental conditions. So it's focused on trauma and very specifically looking at the ACEs study. And their definition of neurodevelopmental conditions is more specific than what we're talking about and the interplay between them. So just to give ourselves all a quick reminder, the adverse childhood experiences are the ACEs research study. And we talked about physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, emotional and physical neglect, living with a family member with mental health or substance use disorders, witnessing domestic violence, sudden separation from a loved one, poverty, racism and discrimination, violence in the community. So those are the ACEs, and we look at people's scores and they have real impactful mental health and physiological impact on a person's lifetime health and mental health. So the neurodevelopmental conditions that they compared against the ACEs scores were a specific list: autism spectrum disorders, intellectual disorder, cerebral palsy, learning disability, ADHD, Down syndrome, and then all of the above, some of the and more. So how do people develop neurodevelopmental conditions? And this goes back to our first slides where we talked about everybody has a brain, and you got the genetics and you got the life experiences. So some neurodevelopmental conditions are intrinsic. They are either a genetic predisposition or a perinatal risk factor. So something that happens right during the pregnancy or right around the time of birth. A classic one for that is cerebral palsy. A lot of times cerebral palsy occurs as an insult to the brain, either during the pregnancy itself or during the birthing process. A lot of people don't realize, but cerebral palsy is due to an insult to the brain. So, someone might see that someone has a drawn up arm, or their legs are compromised, or their arms are compromised. It looks very physical, and obviously it is physical, but it comes from the brain. A particular motor section of the brain is damaged, and then those nerves don't innervate, they don't function as expected, and that's how you get someone. That's why cerebral palsy is such a broad condition. You can have someone who has some mild weakness and loss of strength in one limb, all the way to someone who's quadriplegic cerebral palsy and has very limited mobility throughout their entire body. And so CP is a very broad category of disabilities. And so that is categorized under the intrinsic factor. It's sort of baked in, like you came out that way. Versus things that are extrinsic, events that occur after birth. To combine the, cerebral palsy and insult to the brain during, somebody could have a near drowning episode, which is where they drowned, they are not deceased, they're alive, but there's brain damage. And then whatever happens from there is not an intrinsic factor, it's an extrinsic factor. It happened after birth. So they were comparing adverse childhood experiences and this list of disability, and this is a fairly complex chart, but some things are much more strongly impacted by intrinsic factors. So we have Down syndrome, Tourette syndrome, and cerebral palsy. Those are very intrinsic. They're baked into the system. Moderate impact of intrinsic factors: epilepsy, speech disorder, autism. So it's leaning towards intrinsic factors with some extrinsic factors. Moderately high, meaning there's a combination: intellectual disability, headaches and migraines, developmental delay, learning disability, ADHD, and anxiety. Having worked in mental health for multiple years, I'm very familiar with the way that LD, ADHD, and anxiety runs in families. It was so common that if I had a 7-year-old with separation anxiety who wouldn't go to school, I get the phone call from mom. She's like, my daughter, she won't go to school and she's just really worried about everything all the time and I don't know why. And I'm like, I have a clue. But again, we're like, are we intrinsic or extrinsic? Is this learned behavior, or did you all get a certain genetic roll of the dice? Or is it all of the above? Is it that you got a particular genetic roll of the dice and there's more than a couple of aces going on? Do you have a thought?
Porque no los dos. Why not both?
Yeah.
Get a 2-for-1 special.
Yeah.
I was just also thinking about when we were to harken back to when we were talking about like late diagnosed people and self-diagnosed people, because we're still learning about this.
Mhm.
There's still so much research that needs to be done, and there was still this giant wave of people that were like, no, you're fine, just don't do that weird thing. And now we're like, oh no, that's a thing.
Right.
That's the
Right.
thing. And so I just think about all of the like unlearning that has to take place and all of the like burnout and shame and stress that I think contributes to a lot of these intrinsic factors, in addition to, the ACEs. You get bullying, you get discrimination, you get stuff that people were picked on for, using their left hand to use the scissors or what have you, or do things a little differently.
Yeah.
So I think it all just kind of then dog piles. The other thought I have is that when you said it's, it probably runs in families. I think it's also something that I hope they might address in the newest version of the DSM that's going to be coming out, is that when they look at assessments, they go, "Does your child do weird things?" And it's like, but if everyone in the family does it,
It's not weird.
it's not weird. It's just how things roll. And so I think that's an inherent flaw in that system. Um,
Yeah. And actually, we're gonna pick on my backyard neighbor again. When his child was diagnosed with autism and was going through the diagnostic process, the psychologist was like, "What does your kid do these odd things?" And he's like, "No, we all do that."
yep.
And so his child was diagnosed first, and then the psychologist is like, "And we should probably talk to you." And he was like, "No, I'm just a normal guy that has some autistic traits." And then when he went through the diagnostic process, he's like, autism is weird to diagnose because I don't notice other people. So I don't know that the way I think and do things is different than the way everybody just does things because this is my normal.
Yeah.
And he and I have had, in the process of him building our deck, he and I have had long, very interesting conversations about what is normal and how does he do it and how do I do it and how do other people do it. He's like, I study people. Even as a kid, I remember watching the other kids so I would know what I was supposed to be doing because my reaction to things didn't fall in line with others. And so this research study focuses very specifically on ACEs, and we get that. And then we get to the last category, which is highly correlated with extrinsic factors, behavior problems, depression, substance use disorder. Less genetic and more like, what have you lived through? What Chris is referring to is what I've referred to as micro trauma. I grew up ADHD. And so my entire childhood, and any of you have ADHD here, um, so those of you in the room that have ADHD, what were the most common phrases that teachers and adults said to you when you were a kid? So feel free to drop that in the chat. Mine was, if you would focus, you could just do so much better. Sit down, calm down.
I heard stop talking and then stop reading when I would read in
Oh yeah, I got in
response.
trouble. I got in trouble for reading all of the time.
Yeah.
Because I would read in class all of the time because they're like, stop talking.
Okay, so I'm reading.
Um, so we've got sit down, calm down, sit still, stay in one place. Susan, you have mild spastic cerebral palsy. You've never considered it part of neurodivergent. Yeah, you're neurodivergent because your cerebral palsy doesn't come from your muscles, it comes from your brain. It's the signals that are coming out of your brain that impact your muscles. So yes. Kim, yours was an internal monologue of doing everything perfect. If you would just apply yourself and stop daydreaming, as if that were a thing. I've heard there are people who don't have internal monologues. That would be weird. My head is always in a conversation with itself.
I feel like my brain imagines that it's giving a TED talk, like kind of all the time. Like I'm like, do I have an imaginary audience somewhere?
Yeah, I do.
But then the pressure also that then I think comes from that of like, well, I can't say anything wrong. I don't want to, say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing.
And so you can turn your thoughts off, and I cannot visualize. You cannot visualize stories in my mind. Yeah, some people can and some people can't.
Daydreaming. Yeah.
Yeah.
more internalized ADHD instead of
Susan, I love it. Give her 10, 20 minutes before you realize there's no music. Yeah, I can't watch TV because it disrupts my internal brain. My brain does not like TV.
I watch TV to disrupt my internal brain.
So what we're seeing here is that trauma impacts neurodivergence. And then the flip side that Chris is alluding to is that neurodivergence impacts trauma. Because when you're neurodivergent, you often get a continuous stream of negative input. Stop it, knock it off, pay attention. What are you doing? Why are you so dreamy? You're lazy, you're unmotivated. If you could just pay attention, if you cared about your classwork. And so I refer to that as micro trauma, a constant stream of you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad. I had a client, my student was I think about 15 years old. She had listened to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and we had an in-depth conversation about the Lord of the Rings was really written about World War II. And this child was brilliant. She also had extreme dyslexia and could barely read a menu. Like getting words off a page into her brain was nearly impossible. And she said to me, she goes, "Well, I know I'm really stupid because I can't read." And I'm like, "No, you're brilliant and you can't read. That's an and. It's not a you're brilliant and your brain does not read words off a page because you can listen to books and grasp them at a level that some people never achieve." And but she thought she was stupid because she continuously got messages, not so much from her teachers, but a lot from peers. "Oh, you can't read that. You're such an idiot." And she'd make mistakes. Like in the lunch line, if the signs for the food, if the food was all wrapped up, she didn't know if it was a chicken sandwich or a ham sandwich because and then her anxiety would overwhelm her that I'm gonna make a mistake. I can't read this. The word chicken has way too many letters in it for the number of sounds. Um,
It does.
yeah, chicken has
Chicken.
chicken. Yeah, there's a lot of letters to make a very few amount of sounds. What were you gonna say?
I was just gonna share, it may be in the bibliography, I'm not sure, but I know there's a study that gets referenced quite a lot, and it's that and specifically they looked at ADHD kids, but neurodivergent kids often hear 20,000 more negative pieces of feedback by age 12 than their neurotypical
Yeah.
peers. And so thinking about that, what does that do to your self-esteem, to how you perceive yourself, how you think about yourself, how you go exactly that repeated negative messaging from teachers, peers, parents becomes your inner critic, negative self-talk until you start unpacking it.
Yeah.
And it is super freeing. Thank you for sharing that, Ashley. It is so difficult when you are like not knowing that that's a thing
Right.
and you feel like something's wrong with you and
That you are lazy and unmotivated and should care more. And then you try to care and you do care, but you try and do something and you don't understand the doing of the thing. And as opposed to like in my family, ADHD there's definitely a genetic link because it runs like wildfire in my family. And I look at the difference between me, who was brought up with no awareness, and my sister children who were told from the beginning, "Oh, that's your ADHD acting up. Here are some ideas and what works for you and how do we support you." And like one of the kids does their homework best with really loud blaring music, and one of the kids does homework best with like almost complete silence. And so the parents are like, "That's fine, your brains are different. So let's figure out what works for you and let's figure out how," because of course the blaring loud music child and the silent child were arguing, as you can well imagine. And the parents are like, "You know what? Headphones. Headphones exist."
Noise canceling headphones.
Well, and then the sensory issues. So then it
Well,
was finding the headphones that the kid that wanted the noise found comfortable. But instead of telling the children, you're being difficult, you're being impossible, you should be grateful, I got you headphones, it was more a matter of, okay, these don't work, let's try another pair. Now, then we add the socioeconomic piece to it. My sister and her husband are in a socioeconomic category where they can afford to go buy 4 or 5 different kinds of headphones until they figure out which ones work for this one kid who's got some sensory sensitivity and wants loud music. And to get noise canceling ones for the kid who's like, I just don't want to hear anything and that feel comfortable. So, you know, all the isms, all the intersectionality comes into play, of course, all of the time. We're social workers, we know this. Here's the estimate from Doyle of, how many people are neurodivergent. So 15 to 20% of the population. And again, that's how do you define neurodivergence? And typically the things that get measured are the things that get in the way. The things that are gifts don't get measured as neurodivergence. The fact that you know what shade of white matches that shade of white is never going to be tracked as a problem
or
because
if
it
you're
doesn't
shamed
interfere.
into, or if you're shamed into not talking about it, then you're just going to be a sad potato and you're not going to respond. I think sometimes um, people can be really hesitant to identify because it's also, I mean, it is within under the like disability category. It is
Mhm.
disabling and it's a real thing that does in fact cause different challenges at different times. And because it's not as visible, it's a more internal um, process. I think that it's seen as less legitimate and people are like, no, that's just a moral failing. You should try harder.
Yeah.
It's like, well, when I do try harder, then I get more burnt out and crispy and then it gets 10 times worse, unfortunately.
Yeah. The stress factor of forcing, it's like, again, the simplest example is forcing yourself to use your right hand when you're left-handed. There's a stress to it, and that stress accumulates over time. So any one individual has their own neurodivergence, their own trauma history, and their own history of support and even awareness of their own needs. Because some people have internalized this to the point that I know I'm a bother. And then other people are like, no, I'm not a bother. This is just how my brain works.
And that they can do something with support in place.
Right.
I think that's really the kicker. I mean, it took me till literally this year to request support through the school uh, for, having ADHD because there was so much like internal, like, no, I just need to like, power through. I haven't needed it in the past, and it's like, well, maybe I did, but also maybe I would have been less frustrated and struggled a lot less if I would have had those supports in place.
So Deborah has shared a news article, which is great. Thank you, Deborah. The Irish study is 25% of people as having, but they included anxiety and depression, right? And then Caitlin, you found that clinicians are now hesitant to diagnose ADHD with trauma because the symptoms are so closely related to PTSD. Trauma becomes a barrier for receiving proper care. Like we need to understand that it's both and.
Yeah.
Um, and that they contribute one to another, and there's a feedback loop there, which is why we're talking about, so what do you do about it? Neuro-inclusion and trauma-informed care support success, especially when you look at them both together at the same time. And I presented this at last year. Ohio has an annual trauma-informed care conference, and I presented it at that conference last year, this basic concept. It was interesting. I ended up, after it was over, a man came up to me and he's like, oh, your work dovetails exactly with my work. He does trauma-informed, neuro-inclusive architectural design. He's an architect. And I'm like, I didn't know people like you existed. He's like, oh, yeah, that's what we do. Our firm designs workspaces to be trauma responsive and neuro-inclusive. So the lighting is controllable. We pay attention to sound. We pay attention to availability of green space. We pay attention to psychological safety. So for example, a nurse's desk, that building a break room for the nurses, rather than having them have to wade through the waiting room and pass all the patients, that their break room is through a door right behind them so they can stand up, turn around, and go through a door. And then that break room, he's like, it doesn't have to be fancy, but there's a window to the outside or a skylight. The sound is modifiable, the light is modifiable, the furniture is comfortable, the amenities are your basic food and drink, like that you can take care of your human needs. And that we add in some of those sensory options of music or not, this kind or that kind, that it's not a set, this is the way it is. And it would be really convenient if we put the copy machine in this room. He's like, no, the copy machine does not go in the break room.
Need woosah.
And so I
So
didn't know
not open office plans.
not open office plans. Those are horrible for
Oh.
people.
Terrible.
All right, so then Shannon has shared an article. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody like joining in and sharing resources. So some resources for this. If anyone is not familiar with Ludmila Praslova, Ludmila is she has autism and has written a book called The Canary Code. And her basic premise is that canary in the coal mine, you love it, yes. Canary in the coal mine was a real thing. They literally used to take canaries in little cages down into the coal mines because if the air went bad, canaries are more sensitive than humans. Their little tiny lungs use up oxygen much faster than humans do. And if the canary started to get wobbly and then fell off its perch, they're like, the air down here is bad. Because of their higher sensitivity, all the rest of us need to get out. And the nice thing is they did carry little oxygen tanks with them, and they put a dome over the canary and turned some oxygen on and revived that poor little bird. Although then they took him back in the coal mine another day. Um, and her premise is that particularly people with autism and other neurodiversity are the canaries in a workplace. If a workplace or school environment are toxic to people who are neurodivergent, they're probably also toxic to neurotypical people, but the neurotypical people are going to feel it less and later. And her book is dense. So if you buy I strongly recommend you get the book. It is exceedingly, I mean, she has autism. Okay, so very bright woman with autism. Here's the not surprise. It's exceedingly well researched. The bibliography is immense and it's very well organized and structured. And if you want to, you can just read the end of every chapter where she sums each chapter up. But she talks about what are some neuro-inclusive principles. Have people participate in setting work goals, setting the work and the goals. Focus on the outcome, not how people get it done. Like, we need this result. We need this finished. Don't worry about whether they do it walking around and talking, at their desk, sitting in their car,
Sitting on the floor.
sitting on the floor. Like, let's worry less about how they get it done and more about what is it you want done and what does the end result look like. Allow for flexibility. Organizational justice. Again, people who think very literally. I had a client like this. Teacher had made, he was like 9-year-old boy. Teacher had made a rule, you may only sharpen 2 pencils at a time. Because, she had kids getting up there like, I'm going to spend 15 minutes at the sharpener. Well, my client got upset every time somebody sharpened more than 2 pencils. Teacher, teacher, teacher. And she said to him, don't worry about it. I don't really care if it's 2 or 3 or 4. His brain like exploded. But he's like, but the rule is 2. How many of you have worked in a workplace where there was a rule, but it was a rule-ish? And it was not stated as a rule-ish. It was stated as like in the paperwork, it's an absolute. You will be here at 9. And yet really 9-ish was fine. for someone who's neurodiverse, especially those with a more literal mind, that like is stressful. So can we not just say 9-ish? Can we find a way to have organ? And that's a minor rule, that's not a big deal. But I've worked places where there was a lot of bending of rules allowed. And for someone who's a literal thinker, they're like, then they might bend a different rule to the same amount and get in trouble. And they're like, wait, y'all bend all the rules all the time. Yeah, but that one can't be bent. Well, so yeah.
Or those people can bend that rule, but you can't.
Yeah.
You're like, I didn't get the memo on that. There was no neon sign to explain that to me.
Yes. And so Kathy has put there are advantages, there are strengths with ADD, ADHD, creativity, kinesthetic intelligence, recommended and gifted status, yes. The dyslexic advantage, right? And there are strengths, there are also definitive weaknesses when functioning in a neurotypical world. I do find it annoying when people tell me that ADHD is a superpower. I'm like, it depends. Transparency, again, in neuro-inclusion, and valid measurement. Like, oh, I had a friend who was working at it. She was working at a factory job, and this was a friend of ours from church.
Mhm.
And they didn't get to leave until the shift was over at 3. There were often days where by 2:30 they'd finish the work. And from 2:30 to 3, they were all handed a broom and told to sweep. She's like, there's 12 of us banging into each other with our brooms. And she's like, the work is done. We finished all the, like the way a factory works. Once you've loaded into the machines and gone through and finished the process and all of it is done, you can't make a few extra because it requires starting the whole machine all over again. She goes, can we just go home? And they were like, no, you can't leave till your shift is over. She's like, why can't we leave when the work is over? No, because you can't leave till the shift is over. And so she was paid by time, which was not a valid measurement. She was like, why can't we just be paid by work done? The work is done. She ends up quitting the job because she's like, I lose my mind at the end of every day when 12 of us are wandering around with brooms. She goes, I finally refuse to sweep. She goes, I'm at least going to do something productive. I'm going to sit here and read a book because maintenance is going to come in and clean this room. This is just like absolute waste of time. Deborah, you know someone with neurodiversity that thinks he's being lied to if people are breaking the rules and allowed. Yes, it feels like a lie. On some level, it is a lie. You're an ADHD spicy mom with an autism spicy daughter. All my rules are ish, and that always, oh yeah, that combination's fun. And the thing is, when we follow these principles, it doesn't just help the people who are neurodivergent, it helps everybody. Clarity helps everybody. All right. And I'm looking at time and realizing
Yep.
we are. And then the trauma-informed care principles, which I think people are more familiar with, they overlap and dovetail exceedingly well with the neuro-inclusive strategies. Yeah. Some basic commonalities. Don't ask people to prove they're worthy. Collaborate and communicate with people. Be respectful. I feel like that's a really basic. Principles of neuro-inclusion research about autism. So Jessica Dark is a researcher in Australia who does research on autism and talks about how to do research on autism. All right, and we are about at the top of our hour. So I want to move. There's more ideas, and if anyone wants the copy of this, because we have resources, we have bibliography. So I'll get to my email. So feel free to jot down our email, and if you would like to shoot us an email, just send me an email and I will send you a copy of the PowerPoint.
I was gonna say they might be able to send it out to the
list.
listserv as well.
Megan, is there some? Go ahead, Megan.
Yes, I can send it out with the CEs if you are okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You just And you can just send it to me.
All right. There's just so much we could keep talking for
We
another
can
couple
talk
hours.
forever.
This is an amazing conversation, and there's still so much to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I do a presentation on neuro-inclusive parenting.
Uh,
So at the Wendy's Wonderful Kids Conference this year, I'm going to be talking about how to support parents and children who are neurodivergent. So this topic covers all areas of human development.
yeah.
Yeah, for those of you that want more of my presentations, feel free to send me an email that you'd like to be on my training list, because some of the presentations I do are to select audiences like this. And then sometimes I do presentations that are open to other people. I train for the Institute for Human Services, and those are open for anybody to sign up for.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It is 1 o'clock, so we'll have to log off, but I appreciate your time and I look forward to, continuing to learn from you in the future. Yeah,
All right, thank you.
of course. Thank you, everyone, and I will send the evaluation in the email as well. So,
I don't have the chat. Hang on 1 second before you close. I want to save the chat because there were some
mhm.
resources recommended. All right, I got it.
All right. Okay, thank you.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thank you.
Take care.
Bye,
Have a
everyone.
good day, everybody.